There was a woman known in the literature as Miss Beauchamp, treated by James's colleague Morton Prince in the early 1900s. She presented with multiple distinct personalities, each with different memories, different handwriting, different preferences, different moral characters. One personality was prim and religious. Another was mischievous and rebellious. A third was a kind of observer, aware of the others but separate from them. They did not merely coexist. They competed, quarreled, and sometimes left each other notes. William James followed cases like these with intense interest, not because he found them lurid or sensational, though they were certainly remarkable, but because he believed they revealed, in dramatic exaggeration, something that was actually true of all human minds. The self, James had always suspected, was not the unified, continuous, single thing that ordinary experience suggests. Multiple personality disorder was not an anomaly that had to be explained away. It was a revelation about the fundamental structure of selfhood. James had already argued, in the Principles of Psychology, that the human self is not one thing but many. He had distinguished the material self, the social self, and the spiritual self. He had noted that we present different selves to different people and in different contexts. He had explored the concept of the divided self, the internal conflict between different aspects of personality. But the cases of genuine multiple personality pushed him further. They seemed to demonstrate that different streams of consciousness could operate in the same body with complete independence, each unaware of or only dimly aware of the others. The concept James developed to explain these phenomena was the subliminal self, what he later also called the transmarginal field of consciousness. Below the threshold of ordinary waking awareness, James proposed, there are regions of mental life that are genuinely organized, that have their own memories, their own perceptual capacities, their own emotional responses, and sometimes their own apparent agency. In extreme cases, these subliminal regions could crystallize into what appeared to be separate personalities. In ordinary life, they operated as the unconscious processes, the habitual behaviors, the emotional undercurrents, the intuitions and hunches that influence behavior without ever becoming fully conscious. This framework was more phenomenologically careful than Freud's, which used multiple personality primarily as evidence for the repression model. James was less interested in what the different personalities represented symbolically, and more interested in what their existence revealed about the architecture of consciousness itself. And what it revealed, he thought, was that the unity of the self, the experienced sense of being one continuous person, is not a given fact of consciousness but an achievement of integration, maintained by psychological work that most of us do automatically but that can, under sufficient stress or in the right constitutive conditions, break down. Modern trauma psychology and neuroscience have validated and extended this Jamesian insight in extraordinary ways. We now know that severe, early, or repeated trauma can disrupt the normal integrative processes through which a coherent sense of self is constructed. The brain, under conditions of overwhelming threat, may compartmentalize experience, keeping certain memories, emotions, and self-states sequestered from the mainstream of consciousness, as a protective measure. Dissociative identity disorder, as it is now called, is understood as an extreme form of this protective fragmentation, developed in the context of severe early trauma. But the relevance of James's insights extends well beyond clinical pathology. The neuroscientific picture of the self that has emerged over the past few decades is strikingly Jamesian. There is no single brain region, no single neural process, that constitutes the self. The self is a construction, an ongoing, active integration of information from multiple brain systems that generates a coherent first-person narrative. This construction can be disrupted, not just in DID, but in meditation, where the sense of a separate self temporarily dissolves, in psychedelic states, where it becomes porous and strange, in depersonalization disorders, where it feels artificial and distant, and in certain neurological conditions, where specific components of self-experience break down while others remain intact. What James took from the multiple personality cases was not primarily a clinical lesson but a philosophical one. The unity of the self is genuinely fragile, genuinely constructed, and genuinely dependent on conditions. When those conditions hold, we experience ourselves as continuous, unified, and identifiable. When they break down, even partially, we encounter the underlying multiplicity that the integration normally conceals. For ordinary life, this has a liberating implication. The anxiety that many people feel about their inner multiplicity, the sense that because they contain contradictory impulses, incompatible desires, inconsistent values, they are somehow inauthentic or broken, is based on a false ideal of selfhood. The unified self is not the natural starting point that gets disrupted by problems. It is the achievement that gets built through the honest, patient, ongoing work of integration. Every person contains multitudes. The question is whether those multitudes are in conversation or at war. James spent his career trying to understand what human identity actually is, not what we wish it were. The answer he found was complex, fragile, magnificent, and ultimately more interesting than anything simpler could have been. Subscribe to The Psychology of William James and keep exploring the full complexity of what you are.